Welcome back to the daily Rambam class. We are up to chapter 15 of Pesulei Hamukdashim. It is Thursday, so we'll just start with a brief PowerPoint of where we are up to in the Rambam. We are learning the book of the Mishnah Torah. 14 volumes. We are in book number 8, the book of Sefer Avodah, temple service. It has 9 subjects, 95 chapters. We are nearing the end. We learned about the Beis Hamukdash, the temple, the utensils and vessels of the temple, entering the temple, forbidden offerings, bringing offerings, daily and added offerings, and disqualified offerings. So that's where we are now. There are 15 chapters. There are 19 chapters. We are right now up to chapter 15. So next week, please God, when you hear from me, we will be moving on to the service of Yom Kippur. And the following week, we'll be on to the final section, which is Me'ilah. If a person would use material or items that were holy for personal use. So that's what's up on the horizon. But for today, we are in the 7th topic of the book of temple service. We are dealing with disqualified sacrifices, nearing the end. So we are now in the last few chapters have been discussing how thoughts can disqualify an offering. Let's take a look at the text. Okay, so we have something called pigul. Pigul is when a person, pigul is one of the 630 mitzvahs. It's a negative command of something a person should not do. And pigul is when a person eats an offering or offers an offering with the wrong intention, that he intends for it to be eaten either for the wrong reason or in the wrong time. This is called pigul, and that's what we're speaking about at the moment. And he says, any of the sacrifices, whether it's an individual sacrifice or communal sacrifice, any sacrifice that was sacrificed for a different purpose than for that which they were originally intended, are still acceptable. The offering is still acceptable, meaning that you would continue performing all of the subsequent tasks, but they do not satisfy the obligation incumbent upon the owner, with the exception of sin offering and a paschal offering. If they are offered for a different purpose, they are unacceptable. This applies whether one changes the purpose of the sacrifice at the time of the shafting, or at the time when he receives the blood, or when he brings it to the altar, or when he casts it to the altar. The 4 steps that we've spoken about, the 4 steps of the process of bringing a carbon. So in summary, what we've said right now is if when the person was bringing an offering, he intended that it be brought as a different offering than what it was meant for, then the offering does not count for his obligations. If he needed to bring a burnt offering, and he had in mind, he separated a burnt offering, and then as he was offering it, he said, actually, I'm bringing this as a peace offering. So the offering is still acceptable, and they'll continue with the proceedings, but he hasn't fulfilled his obligation of the burnt offering, and so he would still need to bring another. With 2 exceptions. When it comes to the paschal offering or the sin offering, there he needs to have intention for it to be brought for the right offering, and if he intended to bring a paschal offering as a sin offering, for example, then the offering is actually disqualified. And he continues to spell this out. What is meant by saying that the owner does not fulfill his obligation? For example, a person slaughtered an animal designated as a burnt offering, as a peace offering, does not fulfill the obligation of the owner, neither for the burnt offering for which he is obligated, or for the sin offering which he had in mind. Instead, he is obligated to bring another sacrifice. Similarly, if one slaughtered a burnt offering brought by Reuven, but he sacrificed it for the sake of Shimon, it does not fulfill the obligation for Reuven or Shimon. When does the bab apply? When one changed the purpose of the sacrifice intentionally. If, however, one erred and had the impression that the animal was designated as a burnt offering, he had an impression that the animal that was designated as a burnt offering was actually designated as a peace offering, and carried out all of its services for the sake of a peace offering, the owner is considered to have fulfilled this obligation because it was having in mind the wrong type of offering was unintentional. Somebody would want to offer a sin offering or a paschal sacrifice for a different purpose in error, they are acceptable. Or supplanting a purpose mistakenly is of no consequence. If you have in mind that it's a different offering than it is, you separated the right offering, you brought the right offering, you just had in mind that it was the wrong one. If that was accidental, then it is not consequential. Somebody, if one performs malika, which is the form of shechting that's done to a bird, but it's brought as an offering. Well, it's not shechting, it's done with a nail. So if he did that step, that first of the 4 steps of malika on a bird, to be brought as a burnt offering, it was designated as a burnt offering for a different purpose, or he squeezed out his blood for a different purpose, it is acceptable, but he does not fulfill the obligation. And the sin offering of fowl brought for a different purpose is unacceptable. So remember, we said that all offerings, if brought for a different purpose, they are acceptable with the exception of a sin offering. So same goes for birds. Similarly, all of the meal offerings that were offered for a different intention than they originally conceived are acceptable, but the owners don't fulfill their obligation. With the exception of a meal offering of a sinner, again, it's like the sin offering, and a meal offering of a saita. If while performing one of the 4 services one had intent for a different purpose, then they are unacceptable. So generally, if one has the wrong intention, it still is acceptable if it was unintentional, but for a sin offering or a saita offering, it is not acceptable. That applies to flour as well. What is implied? One separated a handful from a free will meal offering for the sake of a meal offering of a sinner. From an offering intended to be prepared in a deep frying pan for the sake of one to be prepared in a flat frying pan, or from one offering intended to be prepared in a flat frying pan for the sake of one to be prepared in a deep frying pan. So since he had in mind a different offering, it doesn't count. Similar laws apply in all similar situations, and it's actually unacceptable if we're speaking about a sin offering. Okay. Moving along, it is forbidden to have an incorrect intention when performing sacrificial service with consecrated animals, as will be explained. Therefore, if I shechted a sacrificial animal for a different purpose, or took a handful from a meal offering for a different purpose, so whether it's shechting an animal or it's flour, whether intentionally or unintentionally, he is obligated to complete the remainder of the service for the proper purpose. Even if one slaughtered the animal, received its blood, and brought it to the altar for an improper purpose, one is obligated to cast it on the altar for the proper purpose. Why are the laws governing a sin offering and the paschal sacrifice is different from those governing all the other sacrifices? And the laws governing a meal offering of a sinner and that of a saint are different from all others because the Torah singles them out. With regards to a sin offering, the Torah says that he shall slaughter it as a sin offering, meaning it specifically it must be slaughtered for the sake of a sin offering. And similarly, all of its other services must be performed for the proper intention. As the Torah says, for his sin, meaning whatever service is necessary to atone for that sin. And when the Torah says that he will atone for him, this means that the service must be performed for the sake of the correct owner. With regards to the paschal offering, again, we have a verse that says that you shall offer a paschal sacrifice to Hashem your Lord. Implied is that all of the acts must be performed for the sake of a paschal sacrifice, a korban Pesach. And as the Torah says that you shall say, it is a paschal sacrifice unto Hashem, implying that it must be slaughtered for the sake of a sacrifice, a paschal sacrifice. Thus, if one altered the purpose for which it was sacrificed or offered it for a different owner, it is unacceptable. And with regards to the meal offering of a sinner, again it says it is a sin offering. With regards to the meal offering of a saint, it says it is a meal offering resulting from envy. The implication is that all of the actions associated with it must be performed for that purpose. So those are the exceptions. Now, when a sin offering is offered for the sake of another sacrifice, for example, it was offered for the sake of a burnt offering, guilt offering, a peace offering, so we said it's unacceptable. If, however, it was slaughtered as an ordinary animal, it is acceptable, but the owner does not fulfill his obligations. If you brought it as a different offering, it's unacceptable, but if you just shechted it to be eaten for dinner, then it is acceptable, it's kosher, but he hasn't fulfilled his obligation. According to the Torah oral tradition, we learn that the intent for sacrificial purposes can disqualify sacrificial animals, but an intent for an ordinary purpose does not. That's just explaining the previous halacha. If one slaughtered an animal designated as a sin offering to atone for another sin, for example, it was brought to atone for the partaking of fat, forbidden fats, and one slaughtered it to atone for partaking of blood, it is unacceptable. So you actually need to have in mind the right sin, the sin for which it was brought. If one slaughtered an animal designated as a sin offering to atone for the sake of another person who was obligated to bring a sin offering, even an adjustable guilt offering, it is unacceptable. So if you brought it for a different person, even though he was requiring of the same offering, that does not work. If, however, one slaughtered it for the sake of another person who was obligated to bring a burnt offering, it is acceptable, but the owner has not fulfilled this obligation because his obligation wasn't of a sin offering, so therefore it doesn't disqualify. Concept mentioned previously derived from the Torah, and he will atone for him or not for his colleague who's obligated to bring a sin offering like he is. So if this person is obligated on a different offering, then it is acceptable, but he hasn't fulfilled his obligation. If one slaughtered an animal designated as a sin offering for the sake of a deceased person, it is acceptable, but does not satisfy the obligation of the owner. Why? Because there is no atonement for the dead. So atonement needs to happen before the person dies, at least through offerings or other mediums that are in this world. If one slaughtered for the sake of a person who is not obligated to bring a sacrifice at all, not a sin offering, nor a burnt offering, nor any other sacrifice, it is unacceptable. Why? Because it could be he is obligated to bring an offering. Maybe he doesn't realize that he sins. So therefore, it's as if it was brought for the wrong offering. If one slaughtered a sacrificial animal with the desired intent, but at the time of the shchita, he had the intent to cast the blood on the altar for a different purpose. It's disqualified. This is pigul. But the intent one has for one service during the performance of another service is significant. Thus, the intent one had during the time of slaughter is considered as if it was the priest's mind at the time he cast the blood on the altar, and the sacrifice is disqualified. A paschal sacrifice that was slaughtered for a different intent, whether for the sake of another sacrifice or whether an ordinary animal, it is unacceptable, as it says, and you shall say it is a paschal sacrifice to Hashem. So it has to be done specifically as a paschal offering. When does the Vav apply? And it was slaughtered on its appropriate time, the day of the 14th of Nisan. Whatever, even if it was slaughtered in the morning of that day, for a different intent, it is unacceptable. If, however, one slaughtered it with a different intent at a time not appropriate for a sacrifice, it is acceptable because it's no longer a paschal offering. It's being brought on a different day. If it was offered for the sake of others and not for its owner, it is considered as if it did not have an owner on the day when it would be sacrificed, and is unacceptable. When a paschal sacrifice was slaughtered with the proper intent on the 14th of Nisan before noon, it's unacceptable because this is not the time for the sacrifice. If it was older than a year and it was slaughtered at the appropriate time for the sake of a paschal sacrifice, and similarly, if one of the other sacrifices was slaughtered for the sake of a paschal sacrifice, even if it was slaughtered after noon, they are acceptable, but the owners do not fulfill their obligation. So before 12 is unacceptable, after 12 is acceptable, but they don't fulfill their obligation if it was done the wrong age or the wrong way. Let's talk about a Thanksgiving offering. A Thanksgiving offering is slaughtered for the sake of a peace offering. The owner's obligation is fulfilled. They're both under the same group. When a peace offering is slaughtered for the sake of a Thanksgiving offering, now right now the owner's obligation is not fulfilled. Why? A Thanksgiving offering is called a peace offering, but a peace offering is not called a Thanksgiving offering. When a burnt offering was slaughtered for the sake of another person who was not obligated to bring a sacrifice at all, the owner does not fulfill his obligation, for it was not slaughtered for his sake. Although the person for whom it was sacrificed is not liable for any sacrifice at his own mind, it is impossible that he is not obligated to seek atonement from heaven, for there is no Jewish person who has never violated a single command. So therefore, it's as if it was brought for a different offering. Although you might think that he wasn't obligated in any, he must have been. When a burnt offering that was brought after the death of a person who set it aside was offered for the sake of that person set aside, and not for the sake of its owner, the owner is considered to have fulfilled this obligation, for there is no conception of ownership for the dead. So if the owner had in mind that it would be brought for a dead person, that's not considered like it was brought for the wrong person, because the other person is no longer in this world. And the 2 sheep to be brought in Shavuos were slaughtered with intent that they were rams. The community is not considered to have fulfilled this obligation. If the priest thought that they were rams and slaughtered them with the intent that they were rams, they are considered to have fulfilled obligations, for the intent was uprooted in error. When a guilt offering of a person to be purified from tzaras was offered for the sake of another type of sacrifice, or its blood was not placed on the thumb and large toe of the person seeking atonements, accompanying offerings are required. For it was offered without accompanying offerings, it would be, for if it was offered without accompanying offerings, it would be as if one offered a free will offering, and a guilt offering is never brought as a free will offering. And the sheep that was brought together with the Omer offering was slaughtered for a different intent. So we count the Omer from when we bring the Omer on the second day of Pesach. So if that sheep was brought for a different intent, one should not bring 2 Esrainim for its accompanying offerings. Instead, he should bring 1 Esrainim, as is brought for other free will offerings. The rationale is that it did not satisfy the obligation. Similarly, when a lamb intended as a continuous offering, a daily offering, was slaughtered for a different intent, or the 2 logs of wood, should not be brought up with it, as is done for the other continuous offerings. And the rationale is that it does not fulfill the obligation of the continuous offering, but instead is like other free will offerings. And the sheep offered on Shavuos was slaughtered for a different intent, was slaughtered before the appropriate time, or after the appropriate time. The blood should be cast upon the altar and the meat eaten, even though the obligation of the community was not fulfilled. If it was the Shabbos, the blood should not be cast on the altar. If it was cast on the altar, it is considered acceptable, in so much as their word should be offered. So although they didn't fulfill the obligation, it's not disqualified. Finally, when the peace offerings of a Nazirite were offered for a different intent, even though the owner does not fulfill his obligation, they are eaten for a day and a night and do not require bread. Similarly, when the guilt offering offered of a Nazirite or the guilt offering of one to be purified from tzaras were offered for a different intent, they are eaten even though the owner does not fulfill his obligation. Gentlemen, I apologize that I was not prepared. During this holiday period, it is a little more difficult. I'm actually busier than ever with the kids. So I was hoping that it would be a chapter that I was well versed in. It wasn't. I'm sorry for letting you down. But hopefully we've still had the mitzvah of studying Torah together. Let's do the quiz. Let's see how well we can do.
Thank you, Rabbi.
If one had the impression that the animal was designated as a burnt offering, was designated as a peace offering, and carried out all of its services for the sake of a peace offering, is the owner considered to have fulfilled his obligation?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say yes.
I don't think so. I think we say it's acceptable, but I don't think we say
Fulfilled his obligation.
But not, it hasn't fulfilled his obligation, so it would be no.
aha, you are all right. And I
That's
was right.
correct.
Yes. Okay. That's true.
Okay.
Sometimes acceptable is not the same as fulfilled the obligation. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes it is acceptable, but he hasn't fulfilled his obligation. There he said he did. True or false? A wrongful intent for sacrificial purposes can disqualify sacrificial animals, but a wrongful intent for ordinary purposes does not. I think that's true.
True.
I think it's true.
True.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Getting better.
Yay.
In which of the following cases is the owner's obligation fulfilled? When a thanksgiving offering is slaughtered for the sake of a peace offering. Okay. When a peace offering is slaughtered as a thanksgiving offering.
Oh, God.
When slaughtered, an animal designated as a sin offering to atone for another person was obligated to bring a sin offering. So it's one of these first two. I forgot which one worked and which one didn't. We said that a peace offering is a type of thanksgiving offering, or did we say that a thanksgiving offering is a type of peace offering? Do you remember?
I think it's A.
Hey. Well done.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. If one slaughtered a sacrificial animal with the desired intent, but at the time of slaughter had the intent to cast its blood on the altar for a different purpose, is it disqualified?
Yes.
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 Yeah.
Well done.
Yay.
Oh,
Okay, thanks so much for joining. Wishing you a wonderful